Okay, we're going to get started here. Thank you all for tuning in to How Data Informed Atlassian's new San Francisco office design. My name is Ari Kepnes. I'm Director of Market Research at Density, and I'm joined by Omar. Thanks, Omar, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Omar and some of his experience to get started here. Omar is the Senior Manager of Workplace Projects and R&D at Atlassian. He spent his career working for multiple tech companies at a variety of scales. From his early days in the mailroom through managing international fit-outs, he's always had a focus on the user. At Atlassian, he manages projects in North America and Europe, while also researching solutions for the future of workplace globally. And when I say tech companies that Omar has been at, I am not joking there. He's been at Google, Netflix, Dropbox, Stripe, and now at Atlassian. So thank you so much for sharing your experience and being with us today, Omar.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you so much for everyone who is tuning in. We have a bunch of people here, and I'm really excited that you're all taking the time out of your day to spend it with us in conversation. A few quick notes before we get started. At the bottom of your screen or at the top, you should see a folder that has a Q on it. It says Q&A. So this is a Q&A session. And as you tune in and have questions for us, we invite you to please just click that Q&A and submit your questions, and we will be responding to them in real time as we go through. Another quick note here is that we are currently in the studio of Jason Calacanis' This Week in Startups. He's been so generous enough to let us use this space. And what that means is after the recording of this, you will be all seeing us in video. We will be all sharing our video of this space. And again, thank you so much to Jason Calacanis. Jason Calacanis is one of the earliest investors in Density, and he was so generous enough to let us use this space. So thanks again. So out of San Francisco here, we're going to be discussing Omar the photographer, Omar the pointer, an intro to Density and AMA. I'll make that clear in just one second. So Omar here, if you don't know, if you haven't seen he's an influencer on Instagram. Is that right?
False, but yeah, I take photos.
You take photos, yeah. So I just wanted to show you all. Omar has a real eye for design, not just in the sense of creating these spaces, but he's also a photographer. So you can check out his own Instagram at Omar_our photography. And that's kind of an exciting way to start here. The other thing that Omar likes to do that I'm going to make fun of him for is he loves to point. So before joining Density, I knew that dogs like to point. They get trained in pointing. Is that right? But Omar actually, when he was giving me the tour of Atlassian's new office, he pointed to all the great places. And we have some funny photos there.
It's my show hand, and then you got to do your little pose to like get people to understand things.
Well, we're going to understand it. So Thank you so much. All right, so a little bit about Density. Density is where analytics starts in the workplace. So Density is an analytics platform for the connected workplace, and it's powered through our anonymous people count data. So we collect information about how people use space through analytics and through utilization data. And we do this through a device that has industry-leading accuracy, is anonymous, and then feeds into flexible reporting systems and real-time analytics. So I am the Director of Market Research at Density, and what we're really focused on is powering the future of a connected workplace with data, and that's going to be some of the themes that we will be talking about later today. So that's just some context, and again, thanks again for joining us as we get started here. So as you might notice, this is from somewhere that we've all seen before, from Jeopardy. So Omar, we're going to play a little game.
And do we need the theme music for this? It's like bum 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 bum. I'm not good at that. But
nice work. I think you did a great job there. Yeah. So Omar, we're going to kind of go through. These are some categories for the AMA today. The Ask Me Anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way this is going to work is everyone tuning in with that Q box at the bottom of your screen. You can be sharing your questions along the way. And as you do, as we go through some of these questions, please feel free to mention kind of who you are or anonymous, if that's something that's how you want to approach it. And we're going to be going through these different categories. So as we're talking about some of these different categories, feel free to submit your questions on each of these different sections. So we already have a few questions underway that were submitted before. And so before we get started with those, what I'm going to do here is for intentional design, Omar, I'm going to have you walk me through what was the intention for some of these different parts of the campus and some of the data that went into it. So we're going to get started here with intentional design, the column here. So if you have questions on this, please feel free as we're going. All right, so what do we have here? This is a mural or something at Atlassian. Tell me what we're looking at.
Yeah, so obviously at Atlassian, the way we kind of build all of our workplaces is we want them to be, one, a great place to work, but we also want to build them with intention. And what we mean by that is we want everything in the space to serve a purpose. So in this picture, actually, this is a local San Francisco artist named Strider Patton. He's a muralist. We found him through a company called Building 180, who does nothing but match artists with local companies, and they're great. And he, in this picture, is actually painting a part of this larger mural, and it's kind of titled A Confluence, which is also one of our products, which is awesome. But this is a confluence of data that kind of moves up the wall, goes into these little pockets and oscillates, and then comes back out and does that all the way up from the 12th floor to the 14th floor. It's a really great thing to be able to bring local San Francisco artists into the space and enable them to continue to do their own work after that by by hiring them. But it's also great to bring artwork into the space, we think, because it gives people something inspirational, I think a little aspirational as well, within the space to kind of inspire them on a daily basis.
Beautiful. So we're talking about the intentions behind the different design of Atlassian and how data fits in.
Yeah.
And it turns out that the kind of emblematic, the whole experience when you walk into this beautiful space is a illustration by the community of data itself.
Yeah.
Very cool. So there's kind of this metaphorical aspect of data, and then by the numbers, which we'll talk about,
Yeah.
we'll talk about next. And what I really liked about it too, Omar, is when we were there, is that it's marrying both kind of this different textures. It's hard to see, but you have in your space, you have the fluorescent lights, and then you have all these different elements that go through and weave through the whole space. It's kind of a really interesting way of thinking about data in Atlassian's workplace.
Yeah, well, and the staircase also serves another purpose, right? It enables people to move through the space, and you can see someone, but you can catch them on the staircase and have a conversation. And it really enables people to kind of see each other on a day-to-day basis. And when you're in a larger floor plate, that's always hard when you're separated by floors. So that's something we're really kind of focused on, is getting people to bump into each other and have those conversations.
Great. So next up here, this is another space. What was the intention? What was the intentional design in this space, and how did data kind of feed into that?
Yeah, so this is one tiny section of our larger all-hands space, and something we do very intentionally is provide a space in each office that is kind of more of a common space. So as a guest or someone coming for an interview example, you would come into the space. Once you're past the security line, you're just in the space, right? You can go grab yourself a cup of coffee, you can sit down, you might start a conversation with someone, but you might also bump into somebody you knew from before. And this space is really meant to be a space that is very welcoming, but can also serve any purpose we want to. Right now it's set up for, I believe, this was between 10 and 11 a.m. So lots of people having casual meetings here. Someone has a laptop out. But then at 2 o'clock on Thursdays, the screens drop down, the confidence monitor turns on, all the mics turn on, and we have an all hands here. So it's really meant to serve multiple purposes, and it's meant to be the space where everyone can kind of gather within the office.
Beautiful. So I've heard a lot about activity-based working, having different types of work patterns that are reflected in different types of spaces. But it really seemed like when I was in this space with you, that there was so much flexibility there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and you had this all-hand space there on the right with with these wooden panels, and then everything was just movable. It was evolving throughout the day. And so that seems to be a pretty unique approach.
Yeah, well, I think that everyone always talks about these different ways of working and what's trending and all these things. But I think what's important is to really know your own users and know what they need to be their most productive selves, right? And do their best work. And I think for us at Atlassian, we believe that the Atlassian workplace team, we believe that people need a space to kind of gather. And this space being flexible is very important for us because it serves many purposes, right? We could be hosting an event here or a meetup or an all hands or lunch, which we do on a daily basis. And it needs to serve all those purposes. So utilizing that space heavily is really important to us because that keeps everyone kind of bumping into each other and meeting with each other, as opposed to being spread out between all these different I guess, perk spaces that are more disparate.
And what about this space here? So this is what was the intentional design behind this space at Atlassian's new office?
Yeah, so we have movement rooms in most of our spaces now, and multi-purpose room, movement room, whatever you want to call it. It's essentially a white box room with somewhat soundproof flooring and some much better sound insulation for music. We hold classes here every week, but we really want to give people the tools they need to be as fit as they want to be, or like go on their own wellness journey. I personally participate in the meditation classes here every morning. And people like those are all employee hosted things, the meditation classes, but then the company also puts on fitness classes here. But then there are a number of people too who just kind of pop in here for a quick stretch throughout the day. This space is really just meant to kind of serve whatever purpose you need it to for your fitness or wellness journey. And then you put everything back and it's a blank room again. So again, like we're very into these spaces where the users can kind of make what they want out of it and then put everything away and then just utilize it however they need to.
Cool. So we actually have a question that just came in. And again, that's a reminder to people at the bottom of your screen at the top, there's a Q folder. You can submit questions along the way. And we will weave them into our discussion here as we're going through the different questions. So the question here is that gyms seem to be really popular at workplaces today. Do you think it is the role of the employer to provide wellness and fitness?
That's a great question. I think it is the role of the this is my personal opinion. I think it's the role of the employer to provide balance for people. And I think that at Atlassian, that's something we're really trying to do is provide our employees a balance. There's a reason why we have a movement room and not a gym. We still want our employees to get out of the office and go and do things and go out and be in the community. And like, there's a lot of people from our workplace who take classes at Barry's across the street, or like go to other like little fitness boot camps around the kind of FIDI area. And I think that's important. I think it is a common thing to see companies providing workout spaces. For our purpose, we provide the movement room so that people can use it if they want to, but also we provide showers across the hallway as well, so that you can get cleaned up if you decide to go outside and work out, or work out before work, or after, or between hours. We don't really like have prescribed working hours at Atlassian, so we want to give people the like kind of freedom to do what they need to do.
So on the right here, this is the iconography right outside that room, but I noticed that there was kind of a really intentional design around each of these different sections around your office. Can you tell us about, I know you mentioned, I think there was different spots that you were able to kind of highlight different iconography. So what were they?
Yeah, so we actually, we work really closely with our diversity and inclusion team, and Aubrey Blanche, who's the head of that team, and on all of our spaces actually. And if you want to learn more about that, you can go to atlassian.com/belonging. To learn more about our efforts there. But some of the efforts we've been making internally recently are more towards accessibility and also just general belonging, especially with regards to signage. And it seems like such a little tiny thing to think about, but it really, really is important. So all of our restrooms have gender neutral signage that is actually not a symbol of our male or a female or a half person, half person. It's actually just the architectural symbols, which is the circle and triangle, on the doors, and then the utilities. So you see a picture of a toilet and a toilet, or a toilet and a urinal, and pick whatever function you need. We're trying to take the gender actually out of it because it's really just a functional space. So we're really like, that's one of the things we're doing. But then we're also working really, really hard with an external accessibility consultant to make sure that all of our spaces are kind of beyond ADA compliant, and really focusing on that for a number of our projects that are going forward. And for us, that kind of the viewpoint on that is that the ADA was a great starting point, and it's kind of like the base to make sure that we don't have an unequitable future. But building beyond that is better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really cool to see. I think in the industry how you, as a company, are taking a stance on this and leading in a way that others are following. I also think that as we think about data. And we're going to get into that section, but it doesn't have to be just data in a quantitative sense. Mm-hmm. There's also an understanding of what are the different needs? How do we measure what our employees need? And it seemed like you guys did a lot of work to understand their perspectives of difference or their perspective of needs as you were planning out and being intentional in these designs.
Yeah, well, I think it's number one, it's important to know your users. And for us, our customers or our users are the internal employees. So we spend a lot of time getting to know them, forming relationships. We're starting to even do just quarterly focus groups now with employees, and really like showing them that their feedback is helping to make changes is important, because if people understand that you're actually listening to them, there's a trust that's formed there, and then they're more likely to give you more feedback, and that creates more data for you to work with, right? So your programming gets better, and if your programming is better, your spaces are better. So we always look into that kind of side of it. But I think also in regards to the accessibility, yes, there's a lot of information out there about how to create an accessible space. And it's actually readily available if you go and look for it. I think it's just a matter of the effort and intention.
So in terms of the intentional design here, I mean, I think some of the takeaways that I learned from you, Omar, was that in all these different spots in campus, whether it's the mother's room or the exercise area, the movement room, or even down to the signage, there is a real appreciation for many workplace experiences. There's not one way to experience work at Atlassian. There was an appreciation for all of these different ways of showing up to work and doing so in a way that made, I guess you used the word belonging, but made employees feel like they belong.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a shift. That seems to be a shift in the workplace is something that we just do to get work done, to a place that's almost hospitable or hospitality focused, and then taken to the extreme with doing that across people with differences, whether it be physical or have different needs. And that was really impressive to see. I have to say, I was really impressed by that when we were there. So thanks for sharing that with this industry.
No, thanks, man.
Okay, so on that note here, so in terms of the intentional design, we did go through there, and we learned some of these intentions behind the Atlassian choices. And one thing that worked there is, as you're going through, just to remind you, you can give us questions. We have a few more now underway for our next category, but please feel free to send questions for that Q&A at the bottom of the screen, to submit questions. So now that we kind of have a sense for what is this Atlassian office like, and how intentional are you guys really? And I think there's a conversation next about data. And I'd love to kind of hear your perspective to begin here, about what is the role of data in workplace. I mean, that's a pretty general word. What do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when people think about data, they think just kind of like numbers on a screen, right? But I think if you look back at like the history of how like architects actually like program spaces, there's lots of types of data, right? There's observational data, there's actually like the hard data, which like you can get from sensors like density, for example. And there's conference room booking data, there's Google Calendar information. All these things are kind of like little inputs, but they all help form a larger picture. And then you always have to work within the kind of the constraints of the actual physical space you're given, right? So like, there's no perfect space. There's no place that's just a square with no, power coming in, or no HVAC ducts and things like that. I guess the way we look at data is that we collect data at the beginning of every kind of outset of each project. And that's data about how our individual teams work, the data about what kind of systems they use, like what kind of technology they actually need. And, knowing the departments and knowing the information, the programming information or data about your users and knowing them very well is very important, right? Because if you said to me like, hey, you have this user, let's just give them all one outlet. That doesn't make any sense from a design perspective, because some people might need 2 outlets, some people might need 5, some people might need 20. And we have all different types of users. So I think that the main kind of data we look at pulling down from the cloud, for example, is the way that people meet, and getting information about that is vitally important to us right now, because I think everyone's experienced this in their work lives, where it's like, for some reason, there's never enough conference rooms. And we always have this kind of continual problem with programming, because what we're looking at right now is a bit of kind of problem with how people actually book meeting rooms, how they say they book meeting rooms, and then how they actually who's actually there in person. And so that's something we've been trying to solve actually recently by working with Density. And we've been testing out the new team integration you guys have coming out, and trying to get a real set of information, or a more correct set of information about who's physically present for meetings versus who is shown on the calendar invite. because there's always a bit of a disparity there. But that is one of the main factors we're kind of looking at as a critical piece of data for our the next spaces we're building out.
Did you have hypotheses going in? I mean, we are going to be taking kind of this data-driven and in experimental scientific lens.
Yeah.
So what were some of your hypotheses going forward before the integration, before kind of your launch of this need to actually get data?
Yeah, so we, this is kind of jumping between subjects now, but we'll do it anyway. So we actually, at the outset of each project, we kind of set a thesis for each project, right, or a hypothesis. And what we say is like, hey, so for example, the San Francisco project, we were really focused on kind of solving the meeting room problem and giving people dedicated meeting spaces, right? So it's kind of like, we called it, internally, we called it kind of like playing as, one of our values is actually playing as a team or play as a team. So we called it the good team member exercise internally. And we were trying to give people the spaces they needed and dedicated meeting spaces if they were kind of a super user, right? Someone who's utilizing a conference room 90% of the time. And we think that has worked out so far pretty well. But there's still more information to get. So that was kind of our main focus of the project, was giving people the things they need. And then within that thesis, there's also these little tiny experiments we do as part of the research and development team on the workplace side. So, testing out the density sensor is one of those experiments we're running right now. And then we have a whole set of parameters and goals around those experiments. And then if those experiments are successful, they ship into the larger space. So we're kind of taking a very scientific method for measuring the experiments and kind of putting them forward. And if that hypothesis proves successful, then it becomes a part of the workplace. And that's kind of how we're approaching it. And I think the need has always been there, that we need to get more information. And there's a kind of measurable two-part system, right? You have to say, hey, we have all this data, and it's great to have all the data because it reflects kind of like one viewpoint. But then you also have to go and listen to your users, because if you just look at the data and you don't get the actual nuance of the human perspective, you're kind of missing out, right? So you can't just look at just hard data, and you can't also just go by subjective data. You have to have kind of both. And if you don't have both, then I think you kind of it's a kind of losing battle.
And I love you guys have this kind of use it or lose it policy, which is in many ways marrying both, the data from how are people actually using it by measuring how many people are in a space at any given time.
Yeah.
But then you also kind of have wrapped around this almost cultural or policy around, hey, if you're not using the space, and we know because we're measuring it, maybe it's time to give it back, or what's that about? That seems to be a way you're marrying the two, no?
Well, I think for us that it's not policy. It's more of just something we're kind of testing out. What we're trying to encourage our users to do is that if they need something, to ask for it. If they know they don't need something, to give it back to the company, right? If they're like, hey, we're not using this resource. If you weren't using a laptop, for example, but you had a laptop from the company and you weren't using it, you'd give it back to the IT team and be like, well, here, take this laptop back. If you have a dedicated room and you stop using it for some reason, or you move offices, you would give it back. And so I think we're just trying to make sure that, and this is a very easy thing to do with Atlassian, because most people are really, really great. And I think that we're trying to encourage people to be responsible employees and treat the resources as they would their own, which is a great thing to do. I think for us, what we're trying to get to with the data, and the reason why we're testing it out on ourselves first with density, we're testing density out on our workplace lab, which is our dedicated space, and on the design lab next door, which is for our branding team. First, because we want to test it out on ourselves so that we can show that we're comfortable with it, and then we would ship it to the larger team. A lot of this is built around trust and trying to make sure that everyone's comfortable with it, and also so that they understand that we're not trying to get the data for some nefarious purpose. We're not trying to take resources away from them. For everything we take away from them, we actually kind of give them something different. And that's our intention, is not to just take things away. Our intention is to give them the things they need to be productive and to unleash their potential.
So on that note, we actually have a number of questions that are specific around data by the numbers here with utilization. So do you set any utilization targets for different workplace settings? Or another way of thinking about that is, what is a optimal utilization rate?
Yeah, I think that's tough. I think that you have to have a really, really large portfolio and a really like refined data set to get to that. Otherwise, the utilization data is kind of a misnomer. If you think about it, most workplaces are only utilized what 65% of the time because you're only in the office from, let's say, at the largest companies from 6 a.m. till 9 p.m. And then the rest of that night is just empty office space, right? I think there's a reason why a lot of like companies like Spacious and companies like that have been popping up to kind of fill those gaps for restaurants and things like that as well, because restaurant space is underutilized during the day. But I think that for us, like we're just getting to the point where we're trying to set targets for a specific utilization of specific spaces. The way we've been building things right now is more based on the programming and the local requirements. And I think that in the future, you'll see us kind of moving more towards kind of more data-driven methodology. That said, again, married with the nuance of the actual like subjective data, like the influence of like the local people and what they actually want and need.
So another question on that is, what is the typical occupancy ratio these days for office companies? So in terms of kind of understanding how much space per employee.
Yeah, I mean, like square foot per employee, it's all over the gamut. It's funny. I was touring with a company a few weeks ago who will remain nameless, and they said that their ratio was 225 square feet per person, which I thought was just massive, because a lot of the companies I speak to lately, it's somewhere between like 120 square feet per person to 175 square feet per person, and I think that varies a lot depending on the company. And until you get to a certain size as a company, it's really hard for you to actually understand how much space you need. And this is a bit of a misnomer because every company in the world and every region of the world has different norms. And like what is all right in Asia Pacific as far as like amount of square feet per person is very different than what is acceptable in the UK, for example. And so I think that I think people try to put a number on this and it's kind of impossible, especially once you start to look at the nuance of the information. And then you start to consider the fact that Europe and Asia actually use usable square feet per person instead of rentable square feet per person, which is what we use in the United States. And that throws off everyone's numbers and then it just becomes confusing. So yeah, I think there's no real true ratio. I think it's really just important to know what spaces you need and calculate out that square footage.
So another question related to utilization data, and then we'll jump to some of these others here, but that's great to see that people are interested in that. What are the popular places at your office? So how has utilization data or other data kind of shown you, hey, this is what people want, that people are voting with their feet for the places that they need?
Yeah. So the 13th floor, which is our common space, is incredibly heavily utilized, especially on a beautiful day like this in San Francisco. Yeah, everyone's out in the patios, having meetings, having one-on-ones. I think there's something really special about having outdoor space. But even when people are inside and it's a rainy day in San Francisco, that 13th floor gets a lot of utilization. We put specific things there to draw them there as well. Like there's better coffee on the 13th floor. There's like a lot of like soft seating and amenity space, and we're trying to drive people to that space, so that's why it's kind of heavily utilized. But it's also just the social kind of center of the space, which is really beautiful. Other spaces that are really heavily utilized, our library is heavily utilized. The nooks within our spaces, as we call them, like there's a little seating area underneath the staircase, which is kind of a little hideaway for people who want to get away and work. But what we're really trying to do is give people the opportunity to work the way they want to work or the way they work best throughout the day. And that's really what you see is different people. If you're very good at observing people, you start to notice like you see the same people in different spots at different times of the day, and you start to see the kind of work they're doing, and you really start to understand how they're utilizing the space. And I'm the kind of person where I sit down with them if their headphones are off and start up a conversation. I'm like, why are you using this space right now? Or like if I see someone using a space not in the way I expected them to, or like editing the space or making an adaptation, it's really fun as someone who gets to sit in the office that we built and got to work on the project all the way through to like ask them questions about like why they changed this thing or why did they move this thing. Not in a bad way. I think it's actually great when users adapt the space, but I think there's kind of an equal use case for like social spaces and spaces to retreat in our space. And I think that's great.
Yeah, I think one of the books that you actually recommended to me was How Buildings Learn.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated, speaking of intentional design, but this idea of iterative design.
Yeah.
And that with the data that we're talking about, with these experiments, you can not only understand what you think people want, but then you can prove or disprove it. And it sounds like with your meeting rooms, using density to understand how are these actually being used, and just because they're booked doesn't mean they're being used, and they're such a prized asset.
Yeah.
So you have kind of these shared spaces that are prized commodity, then you have these retreat areas, and it's really cool to see how you think about both in terms of the qualitative and the quantitative data, marrying that experience to get better over time. So in terms of we have a miscellaneous question. So considering you've worked for so many different tech companies, is there anything that you think they're doing that non-tech companies should learn?
Wow, that's a good question. Yeah, so I actually grew up in a very I guess traditional area, and when I first started working in technology companies, I was very, very surprised by the amount of attention that is given, and this is specifically true about Atlassian, the amount of attention that is given to the needs of the user and listening to their feedback. I think that a lot of the time at more traditional companies, especially larger companies, it becomes very hard to listen to the personal needs of your users because once you breach Dunbar's number, which is like 150 people, it becomes very hard to know everyone personally, right? So people start to become like a ticket in the system or a number, or it's kind of anonymous. And I think that the best advice, I think that what traditional companies could learn from technology-based companies or companies who are maybe a little bit younger is that focusing on the user is a great thing. And if you focus on the user and you get to know your people and you enable them to do their best work, you are going to have returns on that, right? So I think people look at technology companies and they see this perks war or whatever. And there are companies who are just doing frivolous things and just, not naming any names, doing frivolous things and giving employees things just because other people are other companies are doing that as well. They're like, oh, they're doing this, so we should give them this. But that's a bad thing because you don't want to give people something they don't need because they won't value it. And I think that if you're like building with intention and knowing your users and giving them things they need, you get the return on their own productivity. And people are happier, they're more balanced, they're more productive. I think that's a really good thing they can learn.
Well, that seemed like a great way to kind of encapsulate the conversation, Omar. So we're gonna just finish up here. I want to thank you for your time and your perspective. I see you as someone who is really leading the field of thinking about design in both an iterative way, an intentional way, and using data to do that with putting the user at the center. So thank you for your time, and thank you for everyone who logged in today, took time out of their day to listen to us talk about the workplace. We really appreciate it. We'll be sending around a copy of the video version, so you'll be able to see Omar and I discussing this. It'll look something like what's on the right-hand corner there, but we're in a studio here. And you'll be able to learn more. So if you do want to reach out, please reach out to me or sales@density.io to learn more about how we may be able to make your workplace more data-driven. And then finally, a thank you again to Jason Calacanis for letting us use this space, this beautiful space here that we are at in San Francisco. So please watch the video so you can see where we are when we film this. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. And thanks, Omar.
Thanks for having me.